Welcome back to CrimeWave Radio. Before you settle in for the night, let us know where you're listening from in the comments and what time you're watching this. If you're enjoying these chilling crimes, be sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's relax, turn down the lights, and dive into tonight's disturbing cases. Story 1. The chilling tale of H.H. Holmes, America's first serial killer. On July 7th, 1895, the bustling city of Chicago was shaken by the shocking arrest of Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, better known as H.H. Holmes. Holmes, a charming and well-educated man, was accused of being one of America's first serial killers. His arrest marked the beginning of an investigation that would uncover a series of gruesome murders and a macabre murder castle in the heart of the city. Henry Howard Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, showed signs of a disturbed mind from a young age. He was fascinated by medicine and death, often dissecting animals and conducting experiments. His dark inclinations followed him into adulthood. Holmes attended the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, where he honed his knowledge of human anatomy and chemistry. It was during his time at medical school that he began to engage in fraudulent activities, such as stealing cadavers and using them to collect insurance money. After graduating in 1884, Holmes adopted the alias H.H. Holmes and moved to Chicago, where he would embark on his most sinister endeavors. In 1886, Holmes secured a job at a pharmacy in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago. He quickly charmed the owner, Dr. Elizabeth S. Holton, and her husband. When Dr. Holton passed away under mysterious circumstances, Holmes convinced Mrs. Holton to sell him the pharmacy. He took over the business and began to plot his next move. Holmes purchased a vacant lot across the street from the pharmacy and began construction on a 3-story building that would later become infamous as the Murder Castle. The building was a labyrinthine structure filled with hidden rooms, secret passageways, soundproof chambers, and traps designed to facilitate his heinous crimes. The ground floor housed shops, while the upper floors contained apartments that Holmes rented out to unsuspecting tenants. The World's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1893, provided Holmes with the perfect opportunity to lure victims to his murder castle. Thousands of visitors flocked to the city, seeking accommodation and employment. Holmes advertised his building as a hotel for visitors and used his charm to attract young women, many of whom were never seen again. Detective Frank Geyer, a seasoned investigator with the Philadelphia Police Department, was assigned to investigate the disappearance of the Pitillo family, who had been associated with Holmes. The investigation led Geyer to Chicago, where he uncovered the horrifying truth about Holmes and his murder castle. Geyer's investigation revealed that Holmes had concocted a scheme to collect insurance money by faking the death of his associate, Benjamin Pitillo. However, Holmes had double-crossed Pitillo and murdered him, along with 3 of Pitillo's children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard. Geyer followed Holmes' trail across the country, uncovering evidence of his brutal crimes along the way. On July 7, 1895, H.H. Holmes was arrested in Boston, Massachusetts, on charges of insurance fraud. As the investigation into his activities continued, the true extent of his crimes began to emerge. The Chicago police, led by Detective Frank Geyer, searched the murder castle and found evidence of torture chambers, dismembered bodies, and the remains of several victims. The discovery of the murder castle and the gruesome details of Holmes's crimes sent shockwaves through the nation. Newspapers dubbed him America's first serial killer, and the public was both horrified and fascinated by the macabre story. The investigation expanded as authorities sought to identify the victims and piece together the full extent of Holmes's murderous activities. The investigation into H.H. Holmes and his macabre murder castle was a monumental task that spanned several months and required the collaboration of multiple law enforcement agencies. Detective Frank Geyer, who had been instrumental in uncovering the initial evidence against Holmes, continued to lead the investigation, determined to bring justice to the victims and uncover the full extent of Holmes's crimes. As Geyer and his team searched the murder castle, they were horrified by the discoveries they made. The building was a nightmarish labyrinth of hidden rooms, secret passageways, and soundproof chambers. It became clear that Holmes had designed the structure with the explicit intention of trapping, torturing, and murdering his victims. One of the most chilling discoveries was a room fitted with gas jets, which Holmes had used to asphyxiate his victims. Another room contained a large, airtight vault where Holmes would lock his victims, leaving them to suffocate. The basement of the building was equally horrifying, with acid vats, lime pits, and a dissection table, all used to dispose of the bodies. The investigation team painstakingly documented every detail of the murder castle, cataloging the various implements of torture and methods of disposal that Holmes had employed. They also uncovered personal belongings of some of the victims, providing further evidence of Holmes's guilt. The scale and brutality of the crimes shocked even the most experienced investigators. In addition to the physical evidence found at the murder castle, Beer and his team also worked to piece together the timeline of Holmes's activities and identify his victims. They discovered that Holmes had used multiple aliases and engaged in a wide range of criminal activities, including insurance fraud, bigamy, and theft. His charm and charisma had allowed him to manipulate and deceive those around him, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. One of the key pieces of evidence came from the discovery of a series of letters and documents that Holmes had kept. These documents detailed his fraudulent schemes and provided insights into his twisted mind. They also revealed the extent to which he had planned and premeditated his murders, often targeting young, vulnerable women who were new to the city and had few connections. As the investigation continued, Deere traveled to different states, following leads and interviewing witnesses. He uncovered a pattern of disappearances that coincided with Holmes's movements, revealing that the murder castle was just one aspect of a broader network of criminal activity. In total, it is estimated that Holmes may have been responsible for the deaths of up to 200 people, though the exact number remains uncertain. The investigation also brought to light the stories of some of the victims, many of whom had come to Chicago seeking work or adventure during the World's Columbian Exposition. Among them were Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie and Nanny Williams, and Julia Smythe and her daughter Pearl. These women had trusted Holmes, only to fall victim to his cunning and brutality. By November 1894, the evidence against Holmes was overwhelming, and he was charged with multiple counts of murder, fraud, and other crimes. The trial, which began in October 1895, captured the public's imagination and was widely covered by the media. Holmes, ever the showman, reveled in the attention and often appeared confident and untroubled by the proceedings. The prosecution, led by George Graham, presented a compelling case, detailing the extensive evidence of Holmes's crimes. They called numerous witnesses, including former employees and associates of Holmes, who testified about his deceitful and violent behavior. The testimony of Detective Frank Geyer was particularly powerful, as he recounted the harrowing discoveries made at the murder castle and the evidence of Holmes's systematic and premeditated killings. Throughout the trial, Holmes maintained his innocence, insisting that he was being framed and that the evidence had been fabricated. He delivered lengthy and often incoherent statements in his own defense, attempting to discredit the prosecution and portray himself as a victim of conspiracy. Despite Holmes's efforts to manipulate the proceedings, the jury was not swayed. The weight of the evidence was too great to ignore, and on November 4, 1895, Holmes was found guilty of the murder of Benjamin Keitel. He was subsequently sentenced to death. Following the trial and subsequent conviction of H. Holmes, the nation was left grappling with the magnitude of his crimes. The final moments leading up to his execution were marked by a mix of curiosity, horror, and a thirst for justice. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging, and his execution was scheduled for May 7, 1896, at the Moyamensing prison in Philadelphia. In the months leading up to his execution, Holmes continued to display his characteristic calm and remorseless demeanor. He penned a confession, admitting to 27 murders, but often contradicted himself and left many details ambiguous, further shrouding his true number of victims in mystery. On the morning of May 7, 1896, Holmes was led to the gallows, maintaining his composed and detached demeanor to the very end. In his final statement, He expressed no remorse for his actions and continued to insist on his innocence in some cases. As the noose was placed around his neck, Holmes reportedly remained calm, and with a final drop, he met his fate. The execution of H.H. Holmes brought a sense of closure to some, but for many, the horrors of his actions left a lasting scar. The families of the victims were left to grapple with the loss and the knowledge that their loved ones had fallen prey to a remorseless killer. The impact of Holmes's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims, casting a shadow over the city of Chicago and the nation as a whole. Story 2. The Trial of Dr. Death, Harold Shipman. On the 24th of June 1998, the quiet town of Hyde, near Manchester, England, was shaken to its core by the shocking arrest of Dr. Harold Shipman, known affectionately as Dr. Harry to many of his patients. Shipman was a well-respected family GP who had been part of the community for years. His arrest marked the beginning of an investigation that would uncover one of the most prolific and chilling serial killers in modern history. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England. He grew up in a working-class family and showed academic promise from a young age. Inspired by his mother's battle with terminal cancer, Shipman decided to pursue a career in medicine, determined to help others. He graduated from Leeds School of Medicine in 1970 and began his career as a general practitioner in Todmorden, West Yorkshire. In 1977, he moved to Hyde, where he eventually set up his own practice and became a beloved figure in the community. The initial suspicions about Shipman arose in March 1998, when local undertaker Alan Massey noticed a significant increase in the number of cremation forms signed by Shipman. Massey observed that many of the deceased were elderly women who had died suddenly and unexpectedly. Concerned, he shared his observations with Dr. Linda Reynolds of the Brook Surgery in Hyde. Dr. Reynolds, who had also noticed the pattern, decided to take action. On April 24, 1998, Dr. Reynolds contacted the South Manchester District Coroner, John Pollard, and expressed her concerns about the high death rate among Shipman's patients. She highlighted the unusually high number of cremation forms Shipman had signed, and the fact that many of these patients had not been ill prior to their deaths. The coroner took these concerns seriously and referred the matter to the Greater Manchester Police. Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles, a seasoned investigator with the Greater Manchester Police, was assigned to lead the inquiry. Born on September 3, 1955, in Manchester, Bernard was known for his meticulous approach and unwavering determination. He was joined by forensic expert Dr. John Grenville, an authority in forensic pathology. The investigation initially focused on the recent death of Kathleen Grundy, an 81-year-old widow and former mayoress of Hyde. On June 24, 1998, just hours after a visit from Dr. Shipman, Kathleen was found dead in her home by her daughter, Angela Woodruff. Kathleen's sudden death was a shock to everyone who knew her, as she had been in good health and full of life. Angela, a solicitor, was devastated by her mother's death. Her grief turned to suspicion when she discovered a will among her mother's papers that left Kathleen's entire estate, worth around £386,000 to Dr. Shipman. Angela knew her mother had never mentioned any intention to leave her estate to Shipman, and the signature on the will did not match her mother's handwriting. Convinced that the will was a forgery and that her mother had been murdered, Angela approached the police with her concerns. The ensuing investigation led to the exhumation of Kathleen Grundy's body on August 1, 1998. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of diamorphine, a powerful opioid used in palliative care, in her system. The discovery of the forged will and the presence of diamorphine in Kathleen's body provided crucial evidence against Shipman. As the investigation deepened, Detective Superintendent Postles and Dr. Grenville began to uncover a pattern of suspicious deaths among Shipman's patients. They identified at least 15 cases where elderly women had died under similar circumstances, all of whom had been attended to by Shipman. The victims were mostly elderly women, living alone, and had died suddenly after receiving visits from their trusted GP guide. The mounting evidence painted a chilling picture of a doctor who had betrayed the trust of his patients and taken their lives for reasons that were not immediately clear. The investigation team exhumed the bodies of several other suspected victims, and forensic analysis revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in many of them. On September 7, 1998, Harold Shipman was charged with the murder of Kathleen Grundy and the forgery of her will. Further charges were added as the investigation progressed, eventually totaling 15 counts of murder. The charges sent shockwaves through the medical community and the general public, who struggled to comprehend how a trusted doctor could commit such heinous acts. As the case gained national and international attention, the pressure on law enforcement and the judicial system intensified. The trial of Harold Shipman was set to become one of the most significant and harrowing legal battles in British history. As the investigation into Dr. Harold Shipman progressed, the police and forensic team worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of his crimes. The scope of their findings was staggering, revealing a pattern of calculated murders that spanned decades. The trusted family doctor had, in reality, been a cold-blooded killer, preying on his most vulnerable patients. Following Shipman's initial arrest and the subsequent exhumation of Kathleen Grundy's body, the police began to delve into the medical records of his other deceased patients. They discovered that many of Shipman's victims had died suddenly and unexpectedly, often shortly after he had visited them. The cause of death in these cases was frequently listed as heart attacks or natural causes, but further investigation revealed a more sinister truth. Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles and his team painstakingly reviewed hundreds of death certificates and medical records, looking for patterns and anomalies. They found that Shipman had a tendency to visit his patients unannounced, often administering lethal doses of diamorphine under the guise of providing medical care. The victims were typically elderly women living alone, making it easier for Shipman to carry out his crimes undetected. Forensic expert Dr. John Grenville played a crucial role in the investigation, conducting autopsies and toxicology tests on the exhumed bodies. The results consistently showed lethal levels of diamorphine, a drug that Shipman had easy access to as a general practitioner. The evidence was damning, pointing to a deliberate and methodical pattern of murder. The investigation team also uncovered evidence of financial motives behind some of Shipman's killings. Several of his victims had altered their wills shortly before their deaths, leaving significant sums of money to Shipman. In the case of Kathleen Grundy, the forged will that left her entire estate to Shipman was a key piece of evidence that helped to build the case against him. As the investigation continued, the police began to build a timeline of Shipman's activities, identifying potential victims and linking them to his visits. The sheer number of suspicious deaths was overwhelming, and the team worked tirelessly to gather enough evidence to bring Shipman to justice. In October 1999, after more than a year of intense investigation, Harold Shipman was formally charged with the murders of 15 of his patients. The charges included the murder of Kathleen Grundy, as well as the murders of Marie West, Irene Turner, Lizzie Adams, John Lilly, Ivy Lomas, Muriel Grimshaw, Marie Quinn, Kathleen Wagstaff, Bianca Pomfret, Nora Nuttall, Pamela Hillier, Maureen Marie Ward, Winifred Miller, and Joan Melia. The court heard harrowing testimony from the families of the victims, who spoke of their shock and disbelief at the sudden deaths of their loved ones. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence presented at the trial was the forged will of Kathleen Grundy. Angela Woodruff, Kathleen's daughter, testified about the discovery of the will and her realization that it was a forgery. Her testimony, combined with the toxicology results and the pattern of suspicious deaths, painted a damning picture of Shipman's actions. The prosecution also presented evidence of Shipman's financial motives, showing that he had gained financially from the deaths of several of his victims. They argued that Shipman had exploited his position of trust to manipulate and murder his patients for his own gain. The defense, led by Nicola Davies QC, faced an uphill battle. They attempted to discredit the evidence and argued that Shipman had acted in the best interests of his patients. However, the overwhelming weight of the prosecution's case made it difficult to mount a convincing defense. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Shipman was a calculating and remorseless killer who had betrayed the trust of his patients and their families. The evidence of his guilt was overwhelming, and the jury listened intently as the prosecution laid out their case. The trial of Harold Shipman, one of the most notorious serial killers in history, began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. The courtroom was packed with journalists, family members of the victims, and curious onlookers, all eager to see justice served. The atmosphere was tense as the prosecution, led by Richard Henriques QC, began to lay out the case against Shipman. Richard Henriques, a highly respected barrister known for his eloquence and precision, presented a compelling and methodical case. He meticulously detailed Shipman's pattern of targeting elderly, vulnerable women who trusted him implicitly. Henriques explained that Shipman would visit his patients under the guise of routine care, administer lethal doses of diamorphine, and then falsify medical records and death certificates to cover his tracks. The prosecution's case hinged on several key pieces of evidence. The most damning was the forged will of Kathleen Grundy, which left her entire estate to Shipman. Angela Woodruff, Kathleen's daughter, took the stand to testify about discovering the will and her subsequent realization that it was a forgery. Her testimony was powerful and emotional, highlighting the betrayal and loss she felt. The toxicology reports from the exhumed bodies of Shipman's victims were also crucial. Dr. John Grenville, the forensic pathologist, testified about the lethal levels of diamorphine found in the victims' systems. He explained that the dosage levels were far beyond what would be prescribed for palliative care, making it clear that these deaths were not natural. Additionally, the prosecution presented evidence of Shipman's financial motives. Several of his victims had altered their wills shortly before their deaths, leaving substantial sums of money to Shipman. This pattern suggested that Shipman had exploited his position of trust to manipulate his patients into leaving him their estates. The defense, led by Nicola Davies QC, faced an uphill battle. They attempted to argue that Shipman had administered diamorphine to alleviate his patients' pain and suffering. They claimed that his actions, while misguided, were done out of compassion. However, the overwhelming weight of the evidence presented by the prosecution made it difficult to mount a convincing defense. Throughout the trial, the families of the victims listened intently, seeking justice for their loved ones. They shared stories of their loved ones' lives, their sudden and inexplicable deaths, and the betrayal they felt upon learning that the trusted doctor they had relied upon had been responsible for their deaths. The most poignant moments came when the families read victim impact statements in court. These statements highlighted the profound emotional impact of the murders, describing the pain and loss they continued to feel. Their words underscored the human cost of Shipman's actions and left a lasting impression on everyone present. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that Harold Shipman had operated with calculated cruelty, preying on the vulnerability of his patients for his own gain. The prosecution's case was airtight, leaving little room for doubt about Shipman's guilt. In January 2000, after months of harrowing testimony and meticulous presentation of evidence, the jury retired to deliberate. The nation held its breath as they awaited the verdict. On January 31, 2000, the jury returned with their decision. Harold Shipman was found guilty of the murders of 15 of his patients and the forgery of Kathleen Grundy's will. The judge, Mr. Justice Forbes, sentenced Shipman to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he never be released. The sentence brought a sense of closure to the families of the victims who had endured unimaginable grief and betrayal. However, the true scale of Shipman's crimes remained uncertain. A subsequent public inquiry, led by Dame Janet Smith, concluded that Shipman may have been responsible for the deaths of up to 250 patients over his 27-year medical career. The inquiry's findings shocked the nation and led to significant changes in the oversight and regulation of medical practitioners in the UK. Story 3. The Boston Strangler. On June 14, 1962, Anna Slezer's son arrived at his mother's third-floor apartment in Boston after she failed to appear at church. What he discovered would mark the beginning of a reign of terror that would grip Boston for the next 2 years. Anna lay face-up on the bathroom floor, her housecoat torn open. The cord from her own robe knotted tightly around her neck in a distinctive bow. The killer had staged the scene, making it appear sexually motivated, though the medical examiner would later find no evidence of sexual assault. The police initially treated Slezer's death as an isolated incident. Boston in 1962 was still a place where people left their doors unlocked, where women lived alone without fear, and where violent crime was relatively uncommon in residential neighborhoods. The city's homicide detectives had no way of knowing they were standing at the threshold of what would become one of America's most infamous serial killer cases. 2 weeks later, on June 30th, 68-year-old Nina Nichols was found murdered in her apartment in Brighton. The scene was disturbingly similar. She had been strangled with her own nylon stockings, and the killer had arranged her body in a degrading position. The same day, in the suburb of Lynn, 65-year-old Helen Blake was discovered, killed in an identical manner. The realization struck the Boston police force like a thunderbolt. They were dealing with something unprecedented. By August, the killer struck again. 75-year-old Ida Irga was found in her apartment in the West End, strangled with a pillowcase. The very next day, 67-year-old Jane Sullivan was discovered dead in her Dorchester apartment, face down in her bathtub, strangled with her own nylon stockings. The pattern was becoming clear. The victims were older women, living alone, and the killer somehow gained entry without forcing his way in. The press began connecting the dots, and panic started spreading through the city. Women began installing new locks, and hardware stores couldn't keep up with the demand for security devices. The Boston Record-American ran bold headlines warning of a phantom strangler terrorizing the city. Police Commissioner Edmund McNamara established a special task force bringing together detectives from Boston and the surrounding communities. December brought 2 more victims. Sophie Clark, a 21-year-old African-American student, broke the pattern of older victims. Her murder in her Back Bay apartment sent shockwaves through the city's student population. Just days later, 23-year-old Patricia Bissett was found in her apartment in the Back Bay, strangled in her bed. The killer was evolving, choosing younger victims, but maintaining his signature of using items from the victims' homes as murder weapons. As 1962 drew to a close, Boston had changed. Women who once felt safe now lived in fear. Neighbors who once left their doors open now viewed strangers with suspicion. The police had interviewed hundreds of suspects, followed thousands of leads, but the killer remained a shadow, striking with impunity and vanishing without a trace. And unknown to anyone at the time, this was only the beginning of a terror that would persist for 2 more years, claim more victims, and leave an indelible mark on the city's psyche. The dawn of 1963 brought a chilling shift in the strangler's pattern. On January 4th, 20-year-old Mary Sullivan was discovered in her Charles Street apartment. The killer had grown bolder, more theatrical. He left her body on display, a New Year's greeting card propped against her foot, and the broom handle used as a cruel calling card. The staging of Sullivan's murder suggested a killer who was not just killing, but performing, wanting his work to be seen. The winter months that followed were eerily quiet, leading some to hope the killer had stopped. But on March 6th, the 23-year-old Beverly Salmons shattered this false peace. Her murder in her Cambridge apartment marked a dramatic departure from the strangler's method. Instead of strangulation, Salmons had been stabbed 22 times. 4 stockings were tied around her neck, but they weren't the cause of death. This savage change in technique sent the investigation into chaos. Were they dealing with the same killer, or had their publicity inspired a copycat? May brought another victim, 23-year-old Evelyn Corbin. found in her Salem apartment. The killer returned to his original method of strangulation, but kept targeting younger women. Corbin's murder revealed another disturbing detail. She had been killed in the early morning, just after returning from work as a waitress. The strangler was watching, learning his victim's routines. The summer of 1963 saw the police department drowning in leads. Every suspicious person, every peeping Tom, every domestic dispute was scrutinized for connections to the murders. The task force had swelled to include 50 detectives, yet they seemed no closer to catching the killer. Local newspapers began criticizing the investigation, suggesting that jurisdictional rivalries between different police departments were hampering progress. September 8 brought the murder of Joanne Grant, the 23-year-old industrial designer, in her Lawrence apartment. Witnesses finally provided the first solid description of a potential suspect, a man in workman's clothes who had been asking about a plumbing problem in the building. But like so many leads before, this one led nowhere. The city's fear had evolved into a kind of collective paranoia. Women reported countless suspicious men to the police. Sales of guard dogs soared. Self-defense classes filled up with students. Local hardware stores couldn't keep deadbolts in stock. The Boston Strangler had accomplished something no one thought possible. He had fundamentally changed how an entire city lived. By the end of 1963, the death toll stood at 11 confirmed victims, though some investigators suspected there were more. The killer had transformed from targeting elderly women to focusing exclusively on young, attractive victims in their 20s. This evolution puzzled psychiatric profilers. Serial killers typically had a specific type of victim and stuck to it. This adaptation suggested either multiple killers or someone whose motives were far more complex than initially believed. The investigation had generated over 2,400 suspects, consumed hundreds of thousands of police hours, and filled rooms with witness statements and tip sheets, yet the strangler remained free, leaving the city to wonder not if, but when he would strike again. And in the background, a man named Albert DeSalvo was living a seemingly normal life in Malden, Massachusetts, working as a handyman, raising a family, all while harboring the darkest of secrets. The year 1964 opened with the city of Boston holding its breath. In police precincts across the metropolitan area, detectives were working double shifts, chasing leads that went nowhere. The killer had claimed 11 known victims, but investigators suspected there were others. Women whose deaths hadn't been connected to the pattern, murders in other cities that shared the strangler's signature. On January 4th, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan became the strangler's final confirmed victim. She was found in her Beacon Hill apartment, posed in what would later be described as the killer's most theatrical crime scene yet. The dark burgundy bow tied from her own stocking was wrapped around her neck, and her body was positioned to be visible from the apartment's entrance. Like a twisted artist signing his masterpiece, the killer had left behind more evidence than ever before. But still nothing that could lead police to his identity. The investigation was reaching a breaking point. The task force had interviewed thousands of suspects, including every known sex offender in the state. They'd checked and rechecked alibis, collected fingerprints, and compiled detailed psychological profiles. The city had invested unprecedented resources into the hunt, but the strangler remained a phantom. Then, in 1965, came the breakthrough no one expected. Albert DeSalvo, a man being held at Bridgewater State Hospital on unrelated sexual assault charges, began making statements to fellow inmates about the Strangler murders. His attorney, the prominent F. Lee Bailey, negotiated with authorities, and soon DeSalvo was confessing in detail to all 13 murders. DeSalvo's confessions were extraordinary in their precision. He described details about the crime scenes that had never been made public. He knew what the victims were wearing, how their furniture was arranged, and even what they had said to him before their deaths. He explained how he had posed as a maintenance man or housing authority worker to gain entry to their apartments. The level of detail was stunning. Either he was the killer, or he had somehow gained access to confidential police files. The man who emerged from these confessions was far from the monster Boston had imagined. Albert DeSalvo was a blue-collar worker, married with children, He had served honorably in the army and worked as a handyman, but beneath this ordinary exterior lay a troubled past. Born into poverty and abuse, DeSalvo had shown signs of violence and sexual deviancy from an early age. By his own admission, he had molested hundreds of women in a series of break-ins before escalating to murder. Yet despite his detailed confessions, DeSalvo was never charged with the Strangler murders. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crimes, and some detectives remained skeptical. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison for a series of unrelated sexual assaults, crimes he committed under the alias the Green Man. The story took another dark turn in November 1973, when DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary at Walpole State Prison. His killer was never identified, though many suspected it was connected to his involvement in the prison drug trafficking ring. The man who might have been the Boston Strangler took whatever secrets he still held to his grave. For nearly 50 years, the Boston Strangler case haunted the city like a restless ghost. Some believed DeSalvo was lying, protecting the real killer. Others thought there might have been multiple stranglers. The truth seemed lost to time, until science offered what no confession could: certainty. In 2013, investigators quietly exhumed Albert DeSalvo's body. They had managed to extract DNA from Mary Sullivan's murder scene and needed a comparison. The process was like threading a needle through time. Microscopic traces of evidence preserved for half a century, waiting for technology to catch up to truth. When the results came back, they were definitive. DeSalvo's DNA matched evidence found at Mary Sullivan's murder scene. After 50 years, at least one family had their answer. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Boston Strangler case wasn't the murders themselves, but how they changed the way we think about safety. Before the Strangler, people rarely locked their doors. Women didn't think twice about letting a maintenance man into their homes. There was a trust in society that the Strangler shattered as effectively as any of his crimes. Even today, grandmothers in Boston tell their granddaughters stories about those years. How they would sleep with knives under their pillows. How they'd check their closets before bed. How they learned to fear the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The Boston Strangler didn't just kill 13 women. He killed an entire city's sense of security. Some say Albert DeSalvo was a man split in two. The charming handyman who could talk his way into any apartment, and the monster who would emerge once inside. This dual nature made him all the more terrifying. He wasn't some obvious monster lurking in shadows. He was the man next door, the helpful stranger, the friendly face that concealed unfathomable darkness. As the city sleeps tonight, the ghost of the Boston Strangler has finally been laid to rest, but his legacy lives on in locked doors, in cautious glances, and the way we think about the monsters among us. Not as obvious predators, but as wolves in sheep's clothing, hiding behind masks of normalcy. Perhaps that's the most chilling lesson of all, that evil doesn't announce itself. It knocks politely and waits to be invited in. Story 4. The Trial of O.J. Simpson. On June 12, 1994, in the affluent Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman took their last breaths. Nicole's body was found shortly after midnight, crumpled on the front steps of her condo at 875 South Bundy Drive. Her throat had been slashed so severely that her head was nearly severed. Goldman, a 25-year-old waiter, lay nearby in the shadows of a tree, stabbed multiple times, his hands showing defensive wounds from a desperate fight for his life. The scene was drenched in blood. A single bloody glove lay nearby. A trail of blood drops led away from the bodies, and bloody shoe prints. Size 12 Bruno Magli marked a path from the scene. As police processed the carnage, the call went out to notify Nicole's ex-husband, football legend O.J. Simpson, but Simpson wasn't home. He was on a red-eye flight to Chicago. When police finally reached him, his voice reportedly cracked with emotion as he learned of Nicole's death. He immediately flew back to Los Angeles, where detectives were already piecing together a troubling picture. They discovered Simpson and Nicole's troubled history, domestic violence calls, a divorce, and Simpson's continued obsession with his ex-wife. Detective Mark Foreman found the case's most damning piece of evidence: a matching bloody glove behind Simpson's estate on Rockingham Avenue. Along with the glove, police found blood drops leading to Simpson's front door, and a black leather glove inside his white Ford Bronco. The evidence seemed overwhelming. On June 17th, instead of surrendering to police as agreed, Simpson fled. Robert Kardashian, his friend and lawyer, read what sounded like a suicide note to the press. Then, as nearly every television in America tuned in, the infamous white Bronco chase began. Simpson, armed with a gun, sat in the back while his friend Al Cowlings drove slowly down the Los Angeles freeways. Police followed at a distance, and crowds gathered on overpasses, many cheering for the football hero they still saw as the Juice. The slow-speed chase ended at Simpson's Brentwood home, where he finally surrendered after dark. Inside the Bronco, police found $8,750 in cash, a change of clothes, a loaded .357 Magnum, a passport, and a fake goatee and mustache. The chase had captivated an estimated 95 million viewers, more than that year's Super Bowl. It was just the beginning of what would become the most watched trial in American history. The prosecution seemed to have an airtight case. District Attorney Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden stood before the cameras, confident in their mountain of physical evidence. But O.J. Simpson had assembled what the media dubbed the Dream Team, a group of high-powered lawyers that would change the course of legal history. John E. Cochran, with his theatrical flair and memorable phrases. F. Lee Bailey, the brilliant cross-examiner. Robert Shapiro, the smooth negotiator. Alan Dershowitz, the constitutional expert. And Robert Kardashian, Simpson's loyal friend, who had reactivated his law license just to support his friend's defense. Judge Lance Ito presided over what quickly became a media circus. Court TV broadcast every moment. Newspapers fought for headlines. The public couldn't get enough. Every day, crowds gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs either supporting Simpson or demanding justice for Nicole and Ron. The prosecution's case seemed solid. Simpson had a history of domestic violence against Nicole. Blood matching Nicole's was found in Simpson's Bronco and at his home. The bloody glove found at his estate matched the one at the crime scene. His blood was found at the murder scene. The Bruno Magli shoe prints matched shoes he had owned, but the Dream Team had a different story to tell. They painted a picture of a rushed investigation by racist cops, particularly focusing on Detective Mark Foreman. They suggested evidence had been planted, contaminated, or mishandled. They transformed a case about domestic violence and murder into a referendum on race and police corruption in Los Angeles. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Cochran asked Simpson to try on the bloody gloves. As millions watched, Simpson struggled with the gloves, which appeared too tight. Cochran would later famously tell the jury, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." The prosecution argued the gloves had shrunk from being soaked in blood and frozen and thawed multiple times. But the image of Simpson struggling with the gloves stuck in the public's mind. Behind the scenes, tensions simmered. The prosecution team faced intense scrutiny. Marcia Clark's appearance was criticized daily in the media, while Darden faced accusations of being a race traitor. The Dream Team had its own conflicts, with Shapiro and Cochran clashing over strategy, particularly the decision to play the race card. Every day brought new drama. When Foreman was caught on tape using racial slurs, it seemed to confirm the defense's narrative of police racism. When domestic violence evidence was presented, it painted a disturbing picture of Simpson's relationship with Nicole. The trial wasn't just about murder anymore. It had become a mirror reflecting America's deepest divisions about race, celebrity, domestic violence, and justice. After 266 days of trial, 45 witnesses for the prosecution, 58 for the defense, and more than 100 hours of testimony, everything came down to 4 hours of jury deliberation. On October 3, 1995, at 10 a.m. Pacific Time, an estimated 150 million people stopped what they were doing to watch the verdict. The scene in the courtroom was electric. Simpson stood in a light suit, his hands trembling slightly. The jury forewoman unfolded the paper. We, the jury, in the above entitled action find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder. Time seemed to stop, Simpson mouthed. Thank you to the jury. Fred Goldman, Ron's father, sobbed quietly. Kim Goldman, Ron's sister, collapsed into her hands. America's reaction to the verdict exposed a nation divided. In predominantly black communities, people cheered. Not necessarily for Simpson, but for what they saw as a rare victory against a justice system they believed was stacked against them. In white communities, there was shock and outrage. The same evidence, viewed through different lenses of experience, led to vastly different conclusions. But Simpson's legal troubles were far from over. In 1997, a civil court found him liable for the wrongful deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, ordering him to pay $33.50 million in damages. While he'd avoided prison, his reputation was forever tarnished. The beloved football hero, the charismatic actor from the Naked Gun movies, was gone. In his place was a pariah, unable to escape the shadow of those brutal murders. The aftermath changed everyone involved. Johnny Cochran's "If It Doesn't Fit, You Must Acquit" became part of pop culture, but he passed away in 2005. Marcia Clark left prosecution and became a legal correspondent. Mark Fuhrman's career was destroyed by his racist recordings. The Goldmans and Browns continued their quest for justice, with Fred Goldman pursuing Simpson relentlessly with a civil judgment. Simpson himself couldn't stay out of trouble. In 2007, he led an armed robbery in Las Vegas, attempting to recover sports memorabilia he claimed was stolen from him. This time, there was no dream team, no racial subtext to exploit. He was sentenced to 33 years in prison, serving 9 before being released on parole in 2017. It exposed how domestic violence often escalates to murder. It revealed how the media could transform a murder trial into entertainment. Most importantly, it showed how the same facts could be seen so differently through the lens of racial experience. Today, the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman remain officially unsolved. The bloody gloves, the Bruno Magli footprints, the DNA evidence, none of it led to a criminal conviction. But perhaps the trial's most lasting legacy isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about how justice in America isn't just about evidence and law. It's about narrative, perception, and the deep divisions that still shape our society today. Story 5. The Tylenol Poisonings. On September 29, 1982, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up in her suburban Chicago home with a cold. Her parents gave her an extra-strength Tylenol and sent her back to bed. Within hours, she was dead. No one could have known that this was just the beginning of a crisis that would change American consumer culture forever. That same morning, Adam Janus, a postal worker in Arlington Heights, took Tylenol for mild chest pain. He collapsed at home and died shortly after. In a cruel twist of fate, his brother Stanley and sister-in-law Teresa, grieving at his house later that day, both took Tylenol from the same bottle for their headaches. They too collapsed and died. Mary McFarland, a 31-year-old mother, took Tylenol at work in Elmhurst and collapsed at her desk. Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant, was found dead in her Chicago apartment, a bottle of Tylenol on her bathroom counter. Mary Reiner, who had just given birth to her 4th child, took Tylenol and became the 7th victim in just 3 days. Initially, investigators were baffled. The victims had nothing in common except their sudden, inexplicable deaths. But when Helen Jensen, a nurse at Northwest Community Hospital, made the connection between Tylenol and the deaths, investigators discovered a terrifying truth. Someone had been tampering with Tylenol bottles, replacing the capsules with cyanide-laced counterfeits. The killer had carefully opened the bottles, replaced regular Tylenol capsules with identical-looking ones filled with potassium cyanide, and returned them to store shelves. The poison was so potent that the victims died within minutes of taking the contaminated capsules. The randomness of the attacks was chilling. The killer wasn't targeting specific people, but rather creating a lottery of death where anyone who reached for relief from a headache might end up dead. The response was unprecedented. Chicago Mayor Jane Byrne ordered police to drive through neighborhoods with bullhorns, warning residents not to take Tylenol. Johnson & Johnson, the maker of Tylenol, issued a nationwide recall of 31 million bottles, worth more than 100 million bottles, worth more than $100 million. Hospitals were flooded with panicked people who had taken Tylenol, while others rushed to dispose of bottles they had at home. The murders triggered the largest criminal investigation since the hunt for John Dillinger. Police, FBI agents, and FDA investigators worked around the clock, trying to trace the poison bottles and identify the killer. They discovered that the contaminated bottles had come from different manufacturers and had been purchased from different stores. The killer had somehow managed to poison bottles at multiple locations, creating a web of death across Chicago's suburbs. The investigation quickly focused on James Lewis, a tax consultant with a troubled past. He hadn't poisoned the Tylenol, but he saw an opportunity in the chaos. Lewis wrote a letter to Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million to be stopped. The extortion attempt led to his arrest and conviction, but the actual poisoner remained at large. Another suspect emerged. Roger Arnold, a Chicago dockworker who had bragged about poisoning Tylenol, but Arnold's claims proved false. The ravings of a disturbed man who would later shoot and kill an innocent person he mistakenly believed had turned him in to police. The most intriguing suspect was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who lived in Chicago during the poisonings. FBI agents searched his Montana cabin in 1996, looking for links to the Tylenol murders. They found a list of Chicago area stores and a diary entry about poison, but nothing concrete enough to charge him. But while the killer eluded capture, the murders revolutionized how America protects its consumers. Before the Tylenol poisonings, most medications came with no external safety seals. Pills rattled loose in bottles that anyone could open, contaminate, and reseal. The murders changed everything. Johnson & Johnson led the way, introducing the triple seal safety packaging we know today. A glued box, a plastic seal over the neck of the bottle, and a foil seal under the cap. The FDA made tamper-resistant packaging mandatory for all over-the-counter medications. These changes cost the industry millions, but saved countless lives. The company's response became a textbook example of crisis management. Instead of trying to protect their bottom line, Johnson & Johnson put public safety first. They recalled every Tylenol product nationwide, not just in Chicago. They offered replacement tablets in safer, solid caplet form. Their transparent handling of the crisis actually strengthened public trust, and within a year, Tylenol had regained its market share. The murders also changed how we consume medication. That feeling of checking safety seals, that moment of hesitation before taking a pill. These are echoes of those 7 deaths in Chicago. The killer didn't just murder 7 innocent people. They killed America's innocence about consumer safety. Today, the case remains unsolved. The poisoner's identity is still unknown, though investigators occasionally reopen the case when new leads emerge. The killer might be dead, in prison for another crime, or still walking free. But their legacy lives on in every safety seal we break, in every tamper-evident package we open, in every small reminder that even the most innocent acts, like taking a pill for a headache, can be made dangerous by human malice. Those 7 victims in Chicago changed how we live, how we consume, and how we trust. Their deaths led to protections that have saved countless lives, but somewhere out there, the person who murdered them, the killer who turned medicine into poison, may still be watching as we break those safety seals they made necessary. Story 6. The Long Island Serial Killer. On a cold December morning in 2010, Suffolk County Police Officer John Malia and his cadaver dog were conducting a routine training exercise along Ocean Parkway, a desolate stretch of Barrier Island on Long Island's South Shore. What they discovered would unravel into one of America's most chilling unsolved serial killer cases. The remains of Melissa Bartholomew, wrapped in burlap, were the first to emerge from the thick bramble. The 24-year-old escort had vanished from her Bronx apartment in 2009. Days later, 3 more bodies appeared. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, last seen in Manhattan in 2007, Megan Waterman, who disappeared from a Long Island hotel in 2010, and Amber Lynn Costello, who vanished from North Babylon after arranging to meet a client. All 4 women shared similar stories. Petite in their 20s working as escorts through Craigslist. Their bodies had been disposed of in the same way, wrapped in burlap sacks, hidden in the thick vegetation along the parkway. The killer had carefully placed them approximately 500 feet apart, suggesting a methodical, organized mind at work. But the most disturbing aspect of the case emerged during the investigation of Melissa Bartholomew's disappearance. The killer had used her cell phone to make taunting calls to her teenage sister. Over the course of 7 weeks, he made 8 calls, each lasting less than 3 minutes. He would describe in graphic detail what he had done to Melissa. Police traced the calls to crowded areas in Manhattan, but the killer was careful. He knew how to avoid surveillance cameras and never stayed on the line long enough to be tracked. The search expanded. By spring 2011, investigators had found more remains along Ocean Parkway. The body count grew to 10, then 11. Some victims were identified, others remained nameless. The killer's timeline expanded. Remains dated back to 1996. The case that began with 4 missing escorts had evolved into something far more complex. The media dubbed him the Long Island serial killer, or LISK. Some called him the Craigslist Ripper or the Gilgo Beach Killer. But what made him truly terrifying wasn't just his body count. It was his cunning. He understood police procedures. He knew how to avoid detection. He selected victims who lived on society's margins, women whose disappearances might not immediately raise alarms. And he had been doing it for years, possibly decades, without getting caught. The discovery of more victims painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Unlike the first 4 women, these remains told different stories. The body of a toddler was found, later linked through DNA to another set of remains found 7 miles away. Presumably, the child's mother. An Asian male dressed in women's clothing was discovered, suggesting the killer's victim profile was more complex than initially thought. Then came Fire Island Jane Doe, found in 1996, and Peaches, named for a distinct tattoo on her mutilated torso. The case stretched back further in time, revealing a killer who had been operating undetected far longer than anyone had imagined. Each new discovery raised more questions than answers. The investigation zeroed in on several suspects. James Burke, the Suffolk County Police Chief, drew attention for his suspicious behavior and his history with sex workers. He was later imprisoned for beating a man who stole items from his car, including sex toys and pornographic material. But no direct evidence linked him to the murders. John Bittrolf, a carpenter from Manorville, emerged as another person of interest. In 2014, he was convicted of murdering 2 sex workers in the 1990s. Their bodies posed in ways similar to the LISK victims. His home was only a short drive from where some remains were found. Yet again, investigators couldn't definitively connect him to the Ocean Parkway murders. Dr. Peter Hackett became entangled in the case through Shannon Gilbert, whose disappearance had initially led police to search the area. Hackett had made strange phone calls to Gilbert's mother after Shannon vanished, claiming he ran a halfway house and had treated Shannon the night she disappeared. He later denied making these calls, but phone records proved otherwise. The investigation revealed a darker side of Long Island's affluent beach communities. The killers seemed to know the area intimately. The hidden access roads, the seasonal patterns of the barrier islands, the blind spots in police patrols. He understood that the thick vegetation along Ocean Parkway could hide bodies for years. This wasn't just a dumping ground. It was his killing field. Perhaps most chilling were the phone calls. The killer didn't just taunt Melissa Barthelme's sister. He seemed to revel in his power over his victims' families. He would call from locations near Times Square, mixing with crowds of tourists while describing his crimes. His voice was described as calm, controlled, even well-educated. This wasn't a raging psychopath, but someone who could blend seamlessly into society. In 2020, a major breakthrough seemed imminent when Suffolk County Police released images of a black leather belt found at one of the crime scenes. What belt, embossed with the letters or Wu, depending on orientation, was believed to have been handled by the killer. But like so many leads before it, this one led nowhere. The most controversial aspect of the case centers on Shannon Gilbert, whose disappearance sparked the initial search. On May 1, 2010, Gilbert, a 24-year-old escort, made a frantic 23-minute 911 call from a client's house in Oak Beach. "They're trying to kill me," she screamed before fleeing into the night. Her remains were found in December 2011 in a marsh near Oak Beach. Half a mile from where she was last seen, police initially claimed Gilbert's death was accidental, suggesting she'd become disoriented in the marsh and drowned. But an independent autopsy commissioned by her family told a different story. The hyoid bone in her neck was damaged, consistent with strangulation. Her death bore similarities to the other victims, yet police insisted she wasn't connected to the serial killer case. The investigation has been plagued by allegations of corruption and cover-ups. James Burke, the disgraced former police chief, blocked FBI involvement in the case for years. Some speculate this was to protect powerful clients who used escort services, or worse, to protect the killer himself. The fact that many victims were sex workers led to accusations that police didn't take the cases seriously enough. In 2022, new evidence emerged. Rex Hoyerman, an architect who worked in Manhattan and lived in Massapequa Park, became a person of interest. His height, build, and connection to the area matched aspects of the profile investigators had developed. Cell phone data placed him in locations connected to the victims. But as with previous suspects, conclusive evidence remained elusive. The killer's methodology suggests someone with extensive knowledge of police procedures. They used cash transactions to avoid financial trails. They removed victims' clothing and belongings to eliminate trace evidence. They chose dump sites that would preserve bodies long enough to be found, yet make forensic evidence nearly impossible to recover. This wasn't just a killer. This was someone who understood how to exploit the system's weaknesses. The Long Island serial killer case has changed how we view serial killers in the digital age. This isn't a monster lurking in the shadows, but someone who uses technology to hunt victims and evade capture. They exploit online platforms, understand cell phone tracking limitations, and know how to disappear in our surveillance society. Today, the beaches along Ocean Parkway look peaceful. Tourists still flock to Fire Island. The wealthy still maintain their summer homes. But beneath this normalcy lies an unsolved horror. Somewhere, perhaps among the very people who live and work in these communities, walks a killer who has murdered at least 11 people. Possibly more. They shop in the same stores, drive the same roads, and might even socialize with the families of their victims. The case remains open, the killer unfound, but their legacy lives on in the missing person posters that still flutter in Long Island's sea breeze, in the changed procedures for handling sex worker cases, and in the haunting knowledge that someone who committed these brutal murders might still be watching, waiting and hunting along the shores of Long Island. Story 7. In the early morning hours of February 14th, 2000, while most children her age were sleeping with Valentine's cards ready for school, 9-year-old Asha Degree walked away from her family home in Shelby, North Carolina. The night was cold and rainy, with temperatures around 40 degrees. What makes her disappearance particularly haunting is that multiple witnesses reported seeing something unusual. A small girl, walking alone along Highway 18 at around 4 a.m. Asha lived with her parents, Harold and Aquila Degree, and her older brother Gree, and her older brother Degree, and her older brother, in a comfortable home on Oakcrest Street. By all accounts, she was a happy child, shy but smart, a star student who played basketball and attended church regularly. She was afraid of dogs and, notably, the dark, which makes what happened that night even more mysterious. The last time her parents saw her was at 2:30 a.m. during a power outage. Harold checked on both children, and Asha was asleep in her bed. Sometime between then and 4 a.m., she packed her backpack with carefully selected items. A pair of blue jeans, a long-sleeved white shirt, a black and white long-sleeved shirt, and her Tweety Bird purse. She took her basketball uniform and house key, but left her winter coat behind. Truck drivers reported seeing her walking south along Highway 18, wearing a long-sleeved white shirt and white pants. When one driver turned around to check on her, concerned about a child alone at that hour, Asha ran into the woods. This was the last confirmed sighting of her. The following day, candy wrappers, a pencil, and a marker were found in a shed near where she was last seen. These items hadn't been there the day before. Her parents confirmed the hair bow found nearby belonged to their daughter. Investigators determined Asha had been in that shed, taking shelter from the rain. But what happened after remains one of America's most baffling mysteries. What would make a shy 9-year-old girl who was afraid of the dark leave her warm bed in the middle of a cold, rainy night? Why would she run from potential help? And most importantly, where did she go after seeking shelter in that shed? 18 months after Asha vanished, a contractor working on a construction site near Highway 18 made a disturbing discovery. Buried in the dirt was Asha's backpack, double wrapped in black plastic trash bags. The location was 26 miles from where she was last seen. The backpack contained several items, including the New Kids on the Block t-shirt that wasn't hers, and a Dr. Seuss book that may have come from her school library. The way the backpack was preserved suggested an adult's involvement. It wasn't simply discarded. It was deliberately wrapped and buried, as if someone wanted it to be found eventually. But why? Was it a trophy? A message? Or perhaps a clue deliberately left behind? The investigation revealed other peculiar details. In the days before her disappearance, Asha had been seen looking at a family photo album. Her basketball team had lost a game that weekend. Their first loss of the season, but her parents insisted she hadn't seemed particularly upset about it. There was no sign of forced entry at the house, and her siblings reported hearing nothing unusual that night. The most puzzling aspect was Asha's apparent preparation for leaving. She had packed her backpack methodically, taking specific items but leaving others that would have made more sense for a planned departure. Like her coat, this suggested either careful planning by a 9-year-old or, more disturbingly, possible manipulation by an adult. In 2015, FBI agents revealed they were looking for information about a distinctive vehicle, a dark green early 1970s Lincoln Mark IV, or Ford Thunderbird that may have been seen around the time Asha disappeared. Witnesses reported seeing Asha getting into a similar vehicle, but this detail wasn't confirmed. Then came another disturbing revelation. Investigators discovered that Asha may have been seen getting into an early 1970s Lincoln Continental Mark IV, or Ford Thunderbird, dark green in color, along Highway 18. Was this the same car? And if so, who was driving it? The case took another turn when police revealed they had found a library book from Asha's school in the shed where she had taken shelter. The book wasn't checked out to her, and it wasn't in her backpack when it was discovered. This suggested she might have been carrying items that were never recovered, or that someone else had been in that shed. Over the years, several theories have emerged about what happened to Asha. The first, and perhaps most troubling, suggests she was groomed by someone she knew. The careful packing of her backpack, the timing of her departure, and her willingness to walk along a dark highway all hint at possible manipulation by an adult she trusted. In 2020, authorities released information about 2 items that might be connected to her case: a distinctive concert t-shirt from the New Kids on the Block, and a children's book called McElligott's Pool. by Dr. Seuss. Neither item belonged to Asha, raising questions about whether they were given to her by her abductor or somehow connected to other missing children cases. Another theory centers on Asha's school. In the weeks before her disappearance, she had been reading The Whipping Boy, a story about a young boy who runs away from home. Some speculate this might have influenced her decision to leave, but those who knew Asha say this seems unlikely given her shy, cautious nature and close relationship with her family. The timing, Valentine's Day, has led some investigators to wonder if she was planning to buy or deliver a Valentine's gift. But this doesn't explain why she would leave in the middle of the night, in the rain, without telling anyone. What makes this case particularly haunting is how many elements don't add up. Asha was afraid of dogs and the dark, yet she walked along a rural highway in the middle of the night. She was shy around strangers, yet someone might have convinced her to leave her home. She was intelligent and careful, yet she left without a coat in February. Her parents, Harold and Aquila, have never given up hope. They still live in the same house, keeping the same phone number in case Asha tries to contact them. Every year on February 14th, they march from their home to the billboard with Asha's photo, refusing to let the community forget their daughter. The FBI has doubled the reward for information to $45,000. Age progression photos show what Asha might look like today, but for many in Shelby, she remains frozen in time. A 9-year-old girl in a basketball uniform, smiling shy with her camera. Story 8. The Heist of Baker St. In September 1971, while London slept, a group of thieves pulled off one of the most audacious bank robberies in British history. They didn't just break into a bank. They rented a leather goods shop 2 doors down from Lloyd's Bank on Baker Street, tunneled 40 feet underground, through the London clay, and broke into the bank's vault. But what makes this heist truly extraordinary isn't just how they did it. It's the web of mystery, government secrets, and royal scandal that followed. The mastermind was Anthony Gavin, a photography studio owner who assembled a team that included a ham radio enthusiast, an antique dealer, and several career criminals. Their plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Rent a leather goods shop at 268 Baker Street, tunnel through to the Lloyd's Bank vault during weekends, and empty the safety deposit boxes that held millions in cash and valuables. The gang used walkie-talkies to communicate, and had a lookout monitoring police radio frequencies. They called themselves the Chicken Feed Gang, a name whose significance wouldn't become clear until years later. Over several weekends, they dug their tunnel, working in shifts, hauling out dirt in small bags to avoid suspicion. But here's where the story takes its first bizarre turn. On the night of September 11, 1971, a ham radio operator named Robert Rowlands picked up their radio communications. He heard voices discussing the robbery in progress. "The walls are done. Everything's ready. We're going in. We're through." Rowlands called the police. What happened next has fueled conspiracy theories for decades. The police claim they checked every bank in the area but found nothing suspicious. Yet the robbery continued for the entire weekend. The thieves cleared out hundreds of safety deposit boxes, making off with an estimated $3 million. On Sterling Mill in towns today, when bank employees arrived Monday morning, they found the vault floor littered with empty safety deposit boxes. The tunnel entrance was discovered, a masterpiece of amateur engineering, complete with lights, ventilation, and even a small railway track for removing dirt. But the thieves were long gone, and with them, secrets that some people would kill to keep buried. 4 men were eventually caught and convicted for the robbery, but the majority of the stolen money and valuables were never recovered. And this is where the story transforms from a simple bank heist into something far more intriguing. According to later revelations, the British government issued a D-notice, a media gag order, about certain aspects of the case. The reason? Among the safety deposit boxes were compromising photographs of Princess Margaret, sister of Queen Elizabeth II, allegedly in intimate positions with various lovers. But even more explosive were documents detailing corrupt dealings of prominent politicians and evidence of police payoffs. Some boxes reportedly contained proof of high-ranking MI5 officers taking bribes from organized crime. Michael X, a black power leader in London, allegedly held photographs in his safety deposit box that would have scandalized the British government. He was hanged in Trinidad in 1975 for murder, taking whatever secrets he knew to his grave. His box was among those robbed that weekend. The gang had been tipped off about which boxes to target. They weren't just random thieves, they were working with inside information. Some speculate that MI5 itself orchestrated the robbery to retrieve damaging materials, using career criminals as unwitting pawns. The Chicken Feed gang name suddenly made sense. They were being fed information about which boxes to hit. The police investigation was suspiciously ineffective. Despite Roland's radio intercept and clear evidence of the robbery in progress, no officers discovered the crime until Monday morning. Even more strange, when they did investigate, certain safety deposit box holders were never interviewed or asked to file claims for their stolen property. The getaway vehicle, a van, was found abandoned with some of the stolen items still inside, but the most damaging materials, the photographs and documents, were gone. The recovered items seemed deliberately left behind, as if to make the robbery appear like a simple theft rather than an intelligence operation. The aftermath of the Baker Street robbery reads like a spy thriller. Several key witnesses died under mysterious circumstances. One of the convicted robbers, speaking from prison years later, claimed they had been given blueprints of the bank's vault by a mysterious contact known only as the King. He insisted that certain boxes were marked for them. They weren't to touch others. In 1973, a London detective investigating links between the robbery and government corruption was suddenly transferred to a rural posting. His files disappeared. When asked about the case years later, he would only say, "Some things are better left alone." The most compelling evidence of a cover-up came from the bank itself. Lloyd's never provided a complete list of what was stolen. Many safety deposit box holders never came forward to claim their losses. Unusual for a bank robbery, unless those people had something to hide. Thomas Stevens, a former government minister, later wrote in his memoirs, "The Baker Street robbery was never fully investigated because too many powerful people would have been embarrassed. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the secrets." In 1980, a documentary filmmaker attempted to investigate the case. His studio was broken into, and all his research materials disappeared. The only item taken was a file labeled Baker Street. No other equipment or valuables were touched. The 2008 film The Bank Job brought renewed interest to the case, though it took significant dramatic license with the facts. After the film's release, several former police officers came forward with new information. One claimed he was ordered to lose a certain evidence recovered from the scene. Another said his surveillance team had been deliberately sent to the wrong location the night of the robbery. Perhaps most intriguing was the fate of the safety deposit boxes themselves. After the robbery, Lloyd's Bank quickly replaced the entire vault system. The old boxes were destroyed, an unusual step that prevented any forensic examination. When questioned about this decision years later, bank officials claimed it was simply modernization. Today, the leather goods shop at 268 Baker Street is a Chinese restaurant. Tourists walking past have no idea they're standing above what was once a tunnel that led to one of Britain's greatest unsolved mysteries. Story 9. The Case of Anatoly Moskvin. In 2011, in the historic Russian city of Nizhny Novgorod, police made a discovery that would haunt them forever. Inside the apartment of Anatoly Moskvin, a 45-year-old local historian and cemetery expert, they found 29 life-sized dolls, but these weren't ordinary dolls. They were the mummified bodies of young girls, aged between 3 and 15, each carefully dressed and decorated like macabre toys. Moskvin, known locally as the Professor, was a respected academic who spoke 13 languages and had written extensively about the history of cemeteries. He was a regular fixture in local newspapers, where he published detailed articles about burial traditions and grave sites. What no one knew was that his academic interests masked a far darker obsession. For more than a decade, Moskvin had been digging up the bodies of recently buried young girls. Using his extensive knowledge of preservation techniques, he mummified them using a combination of salt and baking soda. He dressed them in bright dresses, painted their faces with makeup, and decorated them with ribbons and stockings. Some wore knee-length boots and gloves to disguise their decomposed hands and feet. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't just the preservation. It was how he treated them. Each doll had a music box or small speaker embedded in their chest cavity. He would talk to them, celebrate their birthdays, and hold tea parties with them. During holidays, he would change their clothes and positions around his small apartment. He even made name tags for each one, marking the dates of their deaths and when he brought them home. The discovery came after Moskvin's parents, returning from a vacation, noticed something odd about the dolls in their son's room. They had always assumed they were his eccentric collection of large dolls. He had lived with them his entire adult life. But when they looked closer, they realized with horror what they were actually seeing. The question that haunted investigators wasn't just how he had managed to do this for so long without detection, but why? What would drive a brilliant academic to commit such acts? The answer would prove to be as complex as Moskvin himself. In his interrogation, Moskvin was eerily calm, even scholarly in his explanations. He described his processes with academic detachment, as if discussing an archaeological project. He had kept detailed records of each girl, including their names, dates of death, and the cemeteries where he found them. His knowledge of cemetery layouts and burial practices had made his grave robberies virtually undetectable. But when investigators dug deeper into Moskvin's past, they uncovered a traumatic event that seemed to have triggered his obsession. At age 13, he claimed he had been forced to kiss the corpse of an 11-year-old girl at a funeral. According to his account, a group of adults performing what he described as a black magic ritual had made him participate in this ceremony. The girl was dressed as a bride, and the experience had left an indelible mark on his psyche. His apartment revealed the full scope of his fixation. Besides the mummified bodies, investigators found photos and videos of cemeteries, detailed maps marking the locations of young girls' graves, and a vast library of books on death, mummification, and the occult. They also discovered compilations of obituaries he had collected over the years, focusing specifically on young girls. The most chilling items were the diaries. Moskvin had written extensive biographies for each of his dolls, creating elaborate fantasies about their lives. He believed he was preserving them, protecting them from decay, and giving them a form of immortality. In his mind, he wasn't desecrating graves, he was rescuing the girls from death. His methods were sophisticated. Using his knowledge of chemistry and preservation techniques, he had developed a method to maintain the bodies in a remarkably well-preserved state. He inserted desiccants into the corpses and treated their skin with solutions to prevent decomposition. The process took months for each body, and he conducted his macabre work while his parents were away on their frequent trips. When questioned about why he chose only young girls, Moskvin's answer was disturbing in its logic. He said he felt sorry for the children who had died before experiencing life. In his twisted reasoning, he believed he was giving them the chance to live in his apartment, celebrating holidays and birthdays they would never actually experience. The psychiatric evaluation of Annalie Moskvin revealed a mind both brilliant and broken. Doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, noting that he genuinely believed he could bring the girls back to life through a combination of science and black magic. He spoke of learning the language of the dead and claimed he could communicate with his dolls through their music boxes. Perhaps most disturbing were his detailed notes about the girls' families. He had followed many of them, watching as they visited their daughters' graves, documenting their grief. In some cases, he had even left notes for the parents, written from the perspective of their deceased children, telling them not to worry. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a caretaker of lost souls. The court proceedings were unprecedented in Russian legal history. The charges, desecration of graves and dead bodies, seemed inadequate to describe the scope and nature of his crimes. In 2012, Moskvin was declared unfit to stand trial and committed to a psychiatric hospital. His apartment, which locals had begun calling the dollhouse, was sealed off as a crime scene. The impact on the community was devastating. Nizhny Novgorod, a city proud of its academic and cultural heritage, had to reconcile with the fact that one of its most respected scholars had committed such horrific acts. The cemeteries where he had worked became sites of renewed mourning as families discovered their daughters' graves had been violated. Moskin's parents, both in their mid-70s, were destroyed by the revelations. They had lived with their son and his dolls for years, never suspecting the horror under their own roof. His mother later told reporters, "He was a genius child. He learned to read at 3. He could speak multiple languages before he was 12. Where did we go wrong?" In the psychiatric facility, Moskin continued his academic work, writing articles about cemetery architecture and burial customs, though now under strict supervision. He showed little remorse, maintaining that his actions were motivated by compassion rather than malice. When asked if he understood the pain he had caused the families, he replied, "The dead don't feel pain. I was keeping them alive." Periodic psychiatric reviews have consistently found him unfit for release. His case files remain a subject of study for forensic psychiatrists who are still trying to understand the combination of genius and madness that drove him. The music boxes he placed in the girls' chests have been preserved as evidence, though no one has had the heart to wind them up and hear what songs they might play. Today, the story of the doll maker of Nizhny Novgorod serves as a chilling reminder of how the line between academic obsession and madness can blur. The cemeteries he once studied now have increased security, and his academic works have been removed from local libraries. But for the families of his victims, no security measure can erase the knowledge that their daughter's eternal rest was disturbed by a man who thought he could keep death at bay with makeup and music boxes. Moskin remains in psychiatric care, his brilliant mind still fixated on death and preservation. His case continues to challenge our understanding of sanity, obsession, and the dark places where academic pursuit can lead when untethered from moral constraints. In the end, his story is not just about the desecration of graves, but about the desecration of memory itself, and how the pursuit of immortality can lead to the most profound violations of both the living and the dead. Story 10. The Texas Yogurt Shop Murders. On December 6, 1991, in Austin, Texas, as Christmas lights twinkled along city streets, smoke began seeping from the back of an I can't believe it's yogurt shop. When firefighters broke through the front door around midnight, they discovered something far worse than a simple fire. In the back room lay the bodies of 4 teenage girls, stripped, bound, and shot execution style. The victims were Amy Ayers, 13, Sarah Harbison, 15, Jennifer Harbison, 17, who worked at the shop, and Eliza Thomas, 17, another employee. Sarah had been visiting her older sister Jennifer during her closing shift, and Amy was there to walk home with her friend Sarah. What began as an ordinary Friday night at a suburban strip mall had turned into one of Texas's most notorious unsolved crimes. The scene was horrific. The girls had been stacked on top of each other, their bodies badly burned in what investigators determined was an attempt to destroy evidence. Each had been shot in the head. Some had been sexually assaulted. The cash register was empty, but only about $540 had been taken. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. The level of violence suggested something far more sinister. The yogurt shop sat in a busy strip mall on Anderson Lane in North Austin. Customers had been in and out all evening. A patrol car driven past just hours before. Nearby businesses were still open. Yet somehow, between 9:45 p.m., when a customer reported seeing the girls alive, and 11:47 p.m., when the fire was reported, 4 young lives were brutally ended without anyone hearing or seeing anything suspicious. The crime scene itself was a nightmare for investigators. The fire had destroyed most of the physical evidence. Water from the firefighters' hoses had further contaminated the scene. What little evidence remained was compromised by the dozens of emergency responders who had moved through the small shop. The only clear pieces of evidence were the shell casings from a .22 caliber weapon and a single foreign palm print. Austin, then a relatively peaceful college town of 465,000, was shaken to its core. Parents no longer let their teenagers work evening shifts. Kids stopped hanging out at strip malls. The yogurt shop, once a popular gathering place, became a shuttered reminder of innocence lost. The investigation quickly became one of the largest in Austin's history. Over 50 detectives worked the case, following thousands of leads. Everyone had a theory. Some suspected local gang members. Others pointed to drifters passing through town. Many believed the killers must have known the victims, given the personal nature of the crime. In 1999, after 8 years of dead ends, police thought they'd finally cracked the case. They arrested 4 men: Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Morris Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. All had been teenagers at the time of the murders. The arrests were based primarily on confessions from Springsteen and Scott, obtained after hours of intense interrogation. But the case began unraveling almost immediately. There was no physical evidence linking any of the suspects to the crime scene. The confessions, when examined closely, contained numerous inconsistencies, both with each other and with crime scene evidence. Wellborn and Pierce were never tried due to lack of evidence. Springsteen and Scott were convicted in separate trials, largely on the basis of their confessions. Then came the DNA evidence. As testing methods improved, analysts found male DNA on some of the victims that didn't match any of the suspects. In 2009, the convictions of Springsteen and Scott were overturned. The men who had spent nearly a decade on death row were released, and the case was back to square one. The interrogation tapes became a source of controversy. Scott and Springsteen claimed their confessions were coerced through psychological manipulation and threats. The recordings showed detectives feeding them details about the crime, which the suspects then repeated back. Experts who reviewed the tapes called them textbook examples of how false confessions can be extracted from vulnerable suspects. Perhaps most disturbing was the revelation about Maurice Pierce. He had been telling people for years that he was involved in the murders, but many saw this as attention-seeking behavior from a troubled youth. In 2010, Pierce was killed by police during a traffic stop after allegedly attacking an officer with a knife. Some wondered if he had taken vital information about the murders to his grave. The investigation revealed other disturbing possibilities. A similar crime had occurred in Oklahoma just months before. 4 young girls killed in a restaurant that was then set on fire. The cases were never officially linked, but the similarities were striking. There were also reports of a group of men bragging about the murders at a party weeks after the crime. But these leads went cold. In 2011, 20 years after the murders, investigators made a startling announcement. New DNA testing had revealed at least 2 unknown male profiles from the crime scene. These profiles were run through national databases but yielded no matches. The evidence suggested that the real killers might still be out there, perhaps watching as innocent men were convicted and released for their crimes. The case has become a haunting reminder of how justice can go wrong. The Austin Police Department faced harsh criticism for their handling of the investigation. They'd focused so intensely on the 4 original suspects that they might have missed other leads. The coerced confessions became a cautionary tale, taught in law enforcement training, showing how pressure to solve high-profile cases can lead to tragic mistakes. Don Jones, the lead detective who secured the original confessions, later expressed regret about the investigation's methods. "We were under immense pressure to solve this case," he said in a 2016 interview. "Looking back, we might have seen what we wanted to see rather than what was actually there. The families of the victims have lived in a perpetual state of limbo." Barbara Ayers Wilson, Amy's mother, has spent decades fighting for justice. "Every Christmas, instead of celebrating, I remember finding out about my daughter's death," she told reporters. The not knowing is almost worse than the loss itself. The yogurt shop building was eventually demolished, replaced by a new business, but for many Austin residents who lived through that time, the intersection of Anderson Lane and Rockwood still feels haunted. Parents who were teenagers themselves when the murders occurred now warn their own children about the case, creating a generational trauma that ripples through the community. In 2021, the Austin Police Department announced they were using genetic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer. to analyze the DNA evidence. This has given some hope, but the degraded nature of the samples, damaged by fire and water, makes this challenging. The case has also highlighted a disturbing pattern in American justice: the phenomenon of false confessions. Studies show that about 25% of wrongful convictions overturned by DNA evidence involve false confessions. The yogurt shop case is now frequently cited in legal reforms aimed at requiring video recording of all interrogations and limiting aggressive interrogation techniques. Today, the yogurt shop murders remain one of Texas's most infamous cold cases. The four girls, Amy, Sarah, Jennifer, and Eliza, would be in their 40s now. Their friends have grown up, had families of their own, lived the lives that were stolen from them that December night. Their high school yearbook photos, forever frozen in time, still appear in news articles whenever there's new development in the case. The real killers, if still alive, have spent 3 decades walking free. They've lived their lives knowing what they did to 4 innocent teenagers, watching as others were blamed for their crimes. The case remains open, the file still active, waiting for that one piece of evidence, that one DNA match, that one confession that might finally bring justice to 4 families who have waited far too long for answers. In Austin, December 6th remains a dark anniversary. Each year, someone leaves flowers at the strip mall where the yogurt shop once stood. The city has grown, changed, become a bustling tech hub. But it has never forgotten the night when 4 young lives were brutally taken, and a community's sense of safety was shattered forever. Open as document. Story 11. Carl Panzram. On June 20th, 1929, in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, Carl Panzram sat down to write his autobiography. In my lifetime, he began, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry. Born in Minnesota in 1891 to Prussian immigrant parents, Panzram's path to becoming one of America's most prolific serial killers began early. At age 8, he was first arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct. By 11, he was stealing anything he could get his hands on. His family, poor and deeply religious, saw him as a problem child that needed to be reformed. In 1903, at just 12 years old, Panzram's mother signed him over to the Minnesota State Training School, a reform school notorious for its brutal treatment of children. What followed would shape him into the monster he would become. He was beaten regularly, forced to work in freezing conditions, and sexually abused by staff members. In his autobiography, he wrote, I was reformed all right. I had been taught by Christians how to be a hypocrite, and I had learned more about stealing, lying, hating, burning, and killing. The reform school's preferred method of discipline was something called the Oregon boot, a heavy lead-lined steel shoe that weighed several pounds. Boys were forced to wear these for weeks or months, the weight often causing permanent damage to their legs and backs. Panzram wore one for months, developing a lifelong limp and a deeper hatred for humanity. He escaped after 2 years, hopping freight trains and surviving by theft and prostitution. By 15, he had enlisted in the army by lying about his age. His military career lasted less than a year before he was court-martialed for theft and sentenced to 3 years in military prison at Fort Leavenworth, the same prison where he would eventually write his confession. But it was during his first major prison sentence at Montana State Reform School that Panzram's transformation from troubled youth to methodical killer began. He was repeatedly raped by guards and fellow inmates. Instead of breaking him, the experience seemed to crystallize something in him. He later wrote, I made up my mind that I would rob, burn, destroy, and kill everywhere I went. and everybody I could as long as I lived. The most chilling aspect of Panzram wasn't just his crimes. It was his complete self-awareness and lack of remorse. Unlike many serial killers who claim voices told them to kill or who deny their actions, Panzram was proudly honest about his motivations. "I don't believe in man, God nor devil," he wrote. "I hate the whole damned human race, including myself." Between 1915 and 1929, Karl Panzram embarked on a spree of violence that spanned continents. His first documented murder took place in 1920, though he claimed to have killed much earlier. After robbing the home of former U.S. President William Howard Taft and obtaining $3,000, he used the money to buy a yacht. He would lure sailors aboard with offers of work, then rape, kill, and throw them overboard, weighted with rocks. His methodology was brutally efficient. He would gain his victims' trust, often through charm and intelligence that surprised those who met him. He spoke well, could quote philosophy, and possessed a dark charisma that disarmed people. Once he had them alone, he would sexually assault them before killing them, viewing the act as the ultimate form of degradation and power. In Africa, where he traveled after selling his yacht, Panzram's crimes took on an even more disturbing dimension. He hired 6 men to help him hunt crocodiles near the Congo River. After getting them drunk, he shot them all, later writing, "I hired a bunch of natives to work for me, and all I did was shoot niggers. I shot them in the back while they were digging a ditch for me." His travels took him across Africa, Europe, and South America. He set fire to churches, raped countless men. He specifically targeted males because he felt it was more humiliating, and killed indiscriminately. In his autobiography, he detailed burning a church in Philadelphia, causing $100,000 in damage, simply because he didn't like the looks of the place. Perhaps most chilling were his attacks on children. In Salem, Massachusetts, he raped and killed 2 young boys, later writing that he had more fun burning their bodies than killing them. He showed no remorse for these crimes, stating that he wanted to kill everyone I can, and the more I kill, the better I like it. His strength was legendary among prison guards. Once, while incarcerated, he bent the bars of his cell with his bare hands. During another stint in jail, he killed the prison foreman with an iron bar, beating him to death for reporting Panzram's bad behavior. When asked if he felt remorse for this murder, he replied, "I wish I had killed him twice." What made Panzram unique among serial killers was his brutal honesty about his nature. He never blamed his crimes on mental illness, childhood trauma, or supernatural forces. Instead, he viewed himself as a natural product of the American prison system. "I am not in the least sorry," he wrote. "I've done just as I have said I would do. I preyed upon the weak, the harmless, and the unsuspecting." In 1928, while serving a 25-year sentence at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, Panzram met Henry Lesser, a young prison guard who would become an unlikely confidant. Lesser was different from other guards. He treated Panzram with basic human dignity, something Panzram had rarely experienced. When Panzram was denied food as punishment, Lesser secretly brought him sandwiches. This small kindness led to one of the most remarkable documents in criminal history. Lesser provided Panzram with paper and writing materials, and over several months, Panzram wrote his autobiography, a 40,000-word manifesto detailing his crimes, philosophy, and views on human nature. The manuscript is unique not just for its content, but for its articulate, almost scholarly tone. "I look at you through these iron bars and see a man who is disgusted and horrified," Panzram wrote to Lesser. "And yet you don't condemn me or lecture me. For that reason alone, I will tell you the truth about myself." What followed was a document so shocking that it wouldn't be published until decades after Panzram's death. In the manuscript, Panzram detailed not just his crimes, but his worldview. He saw himself as a product of a corrupt system. "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons. I have no desire to reform myself. My only desire is to reform people who try to reform me." And I believe that the only way to reform people is to kill them. While at Leavenworth, Panzram's violence continued. In 1929, he beat the prison laundry foreman to death with an iron bar. When caught, he showed his typical bravado. I killed him because he was just the type of warden's pet. He would tell lies to the guards to curry favor. I hit him with the bar just to see how his head would split. During his murder trial, Panzram acted as his own attorney, telling the jury, "I wish you all had one neck and that I had my hands on it." When found guilty and sentenced to death, he responded, "I certainly do thank you. The sooner I can go out and kill somebody else, the better I'll feel. I have no earthly reason for living anyhow. And the quicker I go to hell, the better it shall be." His correspondence with Lesser continued until the end. In one of his final letters he wrote, "The only thanks you and the human race will ever get from me for your efforts on my behalf is that I wish you all had one neck and that I had my hands on it. I am not sorry for anything I have done. I hate all the people of the earth, including myself." On September 5th, 1930, Panzram was led to the gallows at Leavenworth. In his final moments, he displayed the same defiant contempt that had characterized his entire life. When the executioner asked if he had any last words, Panzram snarled, "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." Even his death was marked by his determination to deny society any satisfaction. When the prison warden suggested he pray, Panzram responded, "I don't want to hear anything about that. I'm not praying. Do you understand? I don't want any of that praying business. I don't want any preacher mumbling over me before I die." He refused last rites and faced death with the same brutal honesty with which he had lived. Henry Lesser kept Panzram's manuscript for decades, trying unsuccessfully to get it published. Publishers found it too disturbing, too raw for public consumption. It wasn't until 1970 that Lesser finally succeeded in getting parts of it published, though the complete manuscript wouldn't be released until 2002 as Killer, a Journal of Murder. What makes Panzram's case so significant in criminal psychology is his complete self-awareness and analytical approach to his own evil. Unlike other serial killers who often deny their crimes or claim insanity, Panzram offered detailed insights into his motivations. He wrote, "Is it not true that I have murdered? That I have committed rape? That I have set fire to buildings? That I have robbed and stolen and plundered? I admit all of these things and I am guilty of them all." His critique of the American prison system was particularly prescient. He argued that reform schools and prisons didn't reform. They created career criminals through abuse and dehumanization. You send a boy to a reform school to learn to be good, and you teach him to be bad. You send him to the penitentiary to be reformed, and you teach him to be worse. Modern criminologists study Panzram's case for several reasons. First, his extraordinary self-awareness provides unique insights into the criminal mind. Second, his description of how institutional abuse shaped his development supports theories about the cycle of violence. Finally, his ability to function in society despite his psychopathy. He could be charming, intelligent, and persuasive when needed. Demonstrates how serial killers can blend into society. The Lesser Panzram correspondence has become a valuable resource for understanding the psychology of violent criminals. Lesser's small acts of kindness elicited more honest introspection from Panzram than any interrogator had managed. This suggests that even the most hardened criminals might respond to humane treatment. Though in Panzram's case, it was too late for rehabilitation. Panzram's legacy lives on in criminal psychology textbooks and law enforcement training. His case is studied not just for its brutality, but for what it reveals about the failure of the American justice system in the early 20th century. The reform schools that abused him, the prisons that hardened him, and the society that created him all came under scrutiny. Today, Panzram is remembered not just as a monster, but as a mirror that reflected the darkest aspects of his time. The brutality of the prison system, the failure of reform institutions, and the cycle of violence that creates career criminals. His final words to Lesser were prophetic. "I am done. There is nothing else to say." But his case continues to speak volumes about criminal psychology, institutional reform, and the nature of evil itself. Story 12. The Butcher Baker. In the vast wilderness of Alaska during the 1970s and early 1980s, Robert Hansen turned the last frontier into his personal hunting ground. By day, he was a respected baker, husband, and pillar of the Anchorage community. By night, he was a predator who would kidnap women, fly them into the wilderness in his private plane, and hunt them like game. Hansen's story begins in Esterville, Iowa, where he was born in 1939. His childhood shaped the monster he would become. Severely acne-scarred, and with a pronounced stutter, he was relentlessly bullied. His strict Danish father, a baker, showed little affection and demanded perfection. Young Robert found solace in hunting, spending hours alone in the woods, developing skills that would later serve his dark purposes. After a troubled youth marked by petty crimes and arson, Hansen moved to Alaska in 1967. The state was experiencing an economic boom due to oil pipeline construction, bringing an influx of people, including many young women seeking work as dancers and servers. Hansen opened a successful bakery in Anchorage, married, and had children. He seemed to be living the American dream. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, Hansen was feeding darker impulses. His first known attacks began in the 1970s. He would target dancers and sex workers, believing they were less likely to be believed if they reported him. His initial assaults followed a pattern. He would offer women money for private photo shoots, then pull a gun and rape them. Many of his early victims reported him to the police, but Hansen's respectable position in the community, a successful business owner, married with children, and known for his hunting trophies, made authorities skeptical of the women's claims. One victim, who escaped after being raped and tortured in Hansen's basement, was told her case wouldn't hold up in court. Hansen's wife provided an alibi, and the case was dropped. This police inaction emboldened Hansen. He escalated from rape to murder, developing a horrifying methodology that combined his hunting skills with his sadistic desires. He would abduct women at gunpoint, restrain them, and fly them in his Piper Super Cub to remote locations in the Alaskan wilderness. There, he would release them and give them a head start before hunting them down with his hunting rifle. Hansen's methodology became increasingly sophisticated. He kept detailed maps marking where he had buried his victims, using small X marks like a twisted treasure map. He chose locations accessible only by plane, knowing that even if bodies were found, the harsh Alaskan environment would destroy most evidence. The vast wilderness became his accomplice, swallowing his victims' remains into its endless expanse. His selection of victims was equally calculated. He specifically chose sex workers and dancers, particularly new arrivals to Alaska who had few local connections. In the boomtown atmosphere of 1970s Anchorage, young women frequently came and went, seeking quick money from the pipeline economy. When these women disappeared, their absences were often attributed to them moving on to other cities. One of Hansen's most chilling innovations was his use of the kill kit, a carefully prepared bag containing weapons, a compass, and other hunting supplies. He would force his victims to carry this kit as he flew them to their death sites, making them unwitting participants in their own murders. He later told investigators he enjoyed watching their faces as they realized what the equipment was for. The true horror of his hunts emerged in later confessions. He would give his victims a head start, usually about 500 yards, before beginning his pursuit. Some women ran for miles through the brutal Alaskan terrain, across rivers, through thick brush, over mountains, before Hansen finally caught up with them. He described these hunts with the same enthusiastic detail other men might use to describe hunting deer or moose. In June 1983, 17-year-old Cindy Paulson escaped from Hansen after he had kidnapped, raped, and tortured her. Unlike his previous victims, Hansen had made a crucial mistake. He hadn't immediately flown her out to the wilderness. Instead, he kept her chained in his basement, planning to fly her out the next day. Paulson managed to escape while Hansen was transferring her to his plane, running barefoot through the streets until she flagged down a passing truck driver. This time, the police couldn't ignore the evidence. Paulson provided detailed descriptions of Hansen's house, his plane, and the torture she had endured. But even then, Hansen's reputation in the community almost saved him. He claimed Paulson was trying to extort money from him, and his wife again provided an alibi. It would take the dedication of Detective Glenn Flood and FBI profiler John Douglas to finally bring Hansen to justice. The breakthrough in the case came when FBI profiler John Douglas created a detailed psychological profile of the killer. His assessment was eerily accurate. A hunter, someone familiar with Alaska's wilderness, likely a business owner who appeared stable and respectable. Most importantly, Douglas suggested the killer would take trophies from his victims and would have a speech impediment that made him feel inferior to women. Armed with this profile and Cindy Paulson's testimony, Detective Flood obtained a warrant to search Hansen's home. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Hidden in the rafters of Hansen's attic was a collection of jewelry and personal items taken from his victims. His trophies. More disturbingly, they discovered an aviation map marked with small X's in remote locations. When confronted with the evidence, Hansen initially maintained his innocence, but after hours of interrogation, he began to crack. In a chilling moment, investigators placed his marked map on the table. Hansen looked at it for a long time before saying, "You guys are going to make me hurt. I don't like to hurt." He then began to explain what each X meant. The map revealed the locations of 17 burial sites, though Hansen would eventually confess to killing 21 women. He took investigators to the sites, flying them in police helicopters to locations only accessible by air. Some of his victims had never been reported missing, their disappearances lost in the transient nature of 1970s Anchorage. His confessions revealed the full extent of his depravity. He spoke of his crimes with a hunter's pride, describing how one victim had given him a good hunt before he caught her. Another had tried to bargain for her life by offering him money and sexual favors. Hansen explained that wasn't what he wanted. The thrill was in the hunt itself. The recovery of bodies was grueling work. Alaska's harsh environment had scattered and degraded many of the remains. Some victims were found with bullet wounds from Hansen's .223 caliber rifle, his preferred hunting weapon. Others showed signs of having been stabbed with the hunting knife he carried. Many had run for miles, their shoes and clothing torn by the rough terrain, before Hansen finally caught them. One of the most heartbreaking discoveries was the body of Joanna Messina, a 24-year-old dancer who had disappeared in 1980. Hansen had marked her burial site with an X, but added a small dot next to it. When asked about the dot, he explained matter-of-factly that it meant she had given him a lot of problems during the hunt. Her remains showed she had been shot multiple times before finally being killed with a hunting knife. In February 1984, Robert Hansen pleaded guilty to 4 murders. Those of Paula Goulding, Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and Andrea Altieri. Though he had admitted to killing 17 women and was suspected of killing even more, prosecutors accepted a plea deal to spare the victims' families the trauma of a trial. He was sentenced to 461 years plus life, without the possibility of parole. The impact of Hansen's crimes fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached missing persons cases, particularly those involving sex workers. The dismissive attitude that had allowed Hansen to operate for so long was replaced with new protocols. Anchorage police established better systems for tracking missing persons and investigating crimes against sex workers. Hansen was sent to Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska, where he lived until his death in 2014. During his imprisonment, he rarely spoke about his crimes, though he did grant one notable interview in 1991, in which he blamed his victims for their deaths, claiming they had forced him to kill them by resisting. The psychological impact on the survivors, particularly Cindy Paulson, was profound. In later interviews, Paulson described how Hansen had forced her to perform for him. making her dance and sing while he held her captive. She suffered from severe PTSD and struggled with substance abuse for years after her escape. However, her testimony had been crucial in stopping Hansen, and she later became an advocate for victims' rights. Detective Glenn Flode, who had led the investigation, spent years after Hansen's conviction trying to identify his unknown victims. Some of the X marks on Hansen's map never yielded bodies, leading investigators to believe there might be more victims still undiscovered in Alaska's vast wilderness. The harsh terrain and wildlife had eliminated any chance of finding some. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of Alaska's exotic dancers and sex workers during the pipeline boom years. Many of Hansen's victims had come to Alaska seeking opportunity, only to find themselves in a dangerous world where their disappearances would go unnoticed. The economic disparity between the wealthy pipeline workers and the women who served them created a perfect hunting ground for predators like Hansen. Perhaps most disturbing was how Hansen had manipulated his respected position in the community. His bakery, the pies and pastries, was popular among law enforcement officers. He would often give free coffee and donuts to police, maintaining friendly relationships with the very people who should have been investigating him. His hunting trophies adorned the walls of his shop, including record-breaking dull sheep, trophies from his legal hunts that helped disguise his darker pursuits. Modern criminal profilers still study Hansen's case for its unique characteristics. His combination of organized planning and hunting expertise made him particularly dangerous. He understood both human nature and wilderness survival, using both to his advantage. His ability to maintain a successful business and family life while conducting his murders demonstrated a level of compartmentalization that psychologists find particularly interesting. Today, the Alaska wilderness still holds some of Hansen's secrets. Some of his victims were never found, their remains scattered by decades of harsh weather and wildlife. The X marks on his map continue to haunt investigators, each one representing a life cut short by a man who turned human beings into prey. The case of the butcher baker serves as a chilling reminder of how a predator can hide behind a respectable facade, and how society's prejudices against certain victims can allow a killer to operate undetected. It also demonstrates the crucial importance of believing victims and taking all missing persons cases seriously, regardless of the victim's background or lifestyle. Story 13. The Nomadic Killer. Israel Key has represented a new breed of serial killer. Methodical, intelligent, and almost impossible to predict. Unlike most serial murderers who operate within a specific geographic area, Keyes was a nomadic predator who meticulously planned his kills years in advance, burying kill kits across the United States and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Born in Utah in 1978 to a fundamentalist Mormon family, Keyes grew up in a strict, isolated environment. His family lived off the grid in rural Washington state, rejecting modern technology and traditional education. By his teenage years, Keyes had developed a fascination with violence and survival techniques that went far beyond typical adolescent interests. After briefly serving in the U.S. Army, Keyes settled in Alaska, working as a construction contractor. To the outside world, he appeared completely normal. He had a daughter, owned a home, paid his taxes, and was known as a reliable worker. But beneath this facade, he was hunting human beings with the same precision he applied to his construction work. Keyes' method was terrifyingly sophisticated. He would travel across the country, selecting victims seemingly at random. Before a planned murder, he would spend months or even years preparing. He would bury kill kits, carefully sealed containers with weapons, cash, and other supplies, in remote locations across multiple states. These caches were so well hidden that some were never found, even after his capture. His approach to murder was equally calculated. Unlike most serial killers who have a specific victim type or method, Keyes chose victims based on opportunity and vulnerability. He would fly to a location, rent a car, drive to one of his pre-positioned kill kits, and then hunt for a victim with cold, clinical precision. One of his most chilling characteristics was his complete lack of emotional connection to his crimes. In later interviews with FBI agents, He described murdering people with the same detachment one might use to discuss a routine task. He took pleasure not in the act of killing itself, but in the meticulous planning and the ability to avoid detection. Keyes' first confirmed murder was Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old coffee stand barista in Anchorage, Alaska. On February 1, 2012, he abducted her during her evening shift, an act captured partially on the coffee stand surveillance camera. What followed was a series of actions that demonstrated his cold, calculated nature. After killing Koenig, Keyes took her body back to his home, where he sexually assaulted her corpse and took photographs. He then posed her body to make it look like she was still alive, using her phone to text her boyfriend and withdraw money from her account to create the illusion she was still alive. He even used her credit card at various locations, carefully avoiding detection. Following Koenig's murder, Keyes took an elaborate trip across the United States. He flew to Texas, rented a car, and drove across multiple states, seemingly to throw off any potential investigation. During this trip, he murdered Bill and Lorraine Currier in Vermont, a couple he chose completely at random. He broke into their home, bound and sexually assaulted them, then killed them and disposed of their bodies in a remote location. What made Keyes uniquely terrifying was his ability to blend into society. Between murders, he would return to Alaska, work his construction job, and spend time with his daughter. He paid his taxes, maintained a clean criminal record, and showed no signs of the monster he truly was. Colleagues described him as quiet but competent, someone who could be relied upon to complete a job. The FBI eventually caught Keyes through a series of mistakes on his part. After murdering Samantha Koenig, he used her stolen credit cards, leaving a trail that investigators could follow. When arrested, he was surprisingly forthcoming about his crimes, but also deliberately vague. He admitted to killing at least 8 people, but suggested the actual number could be much higher. During his interrogations, Keyes spoke about his murders with a chilling detachment. He described choosing victims based on their vulnerability and opportunity, not any personal connection. He took pride in his ability to avoid detection, viewing each murder as a kind of complex puzzle to be solved. When asked about his motivations, he simply stated that he enjoyed the planning more than the actual killing. In June 2012, just months after his arrest, Keyes committed suicide in his jail cell, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. Before his death, he had hinted to FBI agents that he had committed murders in multiple states, potentially as far back as 1996. However, he deliberately withheld specific details, turning his own life story into a macabre game of cat and mouse. Psychological evaluations revealed a complex profile. Keyes didn't fit traditional serial killer models. He wasn't driven by sexual gratification or desire for fame. Instead, he seemed to view murder as an intellectual exercise, a way to demonstrate his superiority over both his victims and law enforcement. His ability to plan murders years in advance, burying kill kits and selecting victims randomly, showed a level of strategic thinking that terrified investigators. Forensic psychologists who studied Keyes noted his complete lack of empathy was unusual even among serial killers. Where most murderers have some emotional trigger or traumatic backstory, Keyes seemed to kill simply because he could. His fundamentalist Mormon upbringing, which emphasized extreme self-discipline and isolation, likely contributed to his ability to compartmentalize his crimes. The most disturbing aspect of Keyes' case was the number of potential victims that may never be identified. During his limited confessions, he implied he had killed people across at least 10 states. His carefully buried kill kits suggested a level of premeditation that could have allowed him to commit dozens of undetected murders. FBI agents estimated that Keyes had likely killed at least 11 people, but he hinted the number could be much higher. Some of his kill kits were never found, and the locations of potential burial sites remain unknown. Each of these undiscovered caches represents a potential crime scene, a potential victim whose story might never be told. His daughter, who was a child during his killing years, was left to grapple with the horrifying reality of her father's true nature. In interviews, she described feeling betrayed and confused, unable to reconcile the father she knew with the monster revealed by the investigation. Her story represents the often overlooked victims of serial killers, their families. The investigation into Keys revealed significant gaps in law enforcement's ability to track nomadic serial killers. His method of traveling across state lines, choosing random victims, and carefully avoiding detection exposed weaknesses in how different jurisdictions communicate and track potential serial murderers. Perhaps most chilling was Keys' final communication with investigators. When asked why he killed, he simply smiled and said, "Sometimes there are things people aren't meant to understand." He turned his own life into a mystery, a puzzle that would continue to haunt investigators long after his death. Law enforcement agencies continue to review unsolved murders from the periods and locations where Keys was known to travel. Each cold case now carries the possibility of being connected to this nomadic killer. His kill kits, some of which may still be buried and undiscovered, represent an ongoing threat. Potential crime scenes waiting to be uncovered. In the end, Israel Keys represented a new type of serial killer, one who killed not for passion or compulsion, but as a form of intellectual exercise. He viewed murder as a complex game, with human lives as nothing more than pieces to be moved and discarded. His legacy is not just the lives he took, but the profound fear he instilled in a nation that realized how vulnerable it truly was.